Yo, this is Bench Gamer here. So yesterday I played Tower Fantasy for about 2 to 3 hours, and by the time I was done with my playtime of those 2 to 3 hours, which is admittedly a very short time, especially for a game like Tower Fantasy, which is an MMO gacha game. You can't even open the chests in that period because there's just so many time gated chests, and that's another thing I'll get back to later on. Basically, during that time period, I came to the conclusion that I have absolutely zero desire, zero motivation, zero interest in continuing to play Tower Fantasy. Tower Fantasy is a mobile PC gacha slash MMO game that recently came out. It's being compared to Genshin Impact, both in China and in the West, for a variety of reasons, not least of which is that it just takes a lot of, inspiration, if you want to call it that, from Genshin, just like Genshin took a lot of inspiration from Breath of the Wild. The difference is that Genshin actually made a pretty damn good game, whereas Tower Fantasy, I'm not really sure who Tower Fantasy is trying to market themselves to. So let's just start from the beginning. The start of my experience with Tower Fantasy and why I don't really like it that much. When I tried to first launch Tower Fantasy, it just gave me this minimized window that you can see here in my community tab. Yeah, so I tried to launch it and it just gave me this tiny window that I couldn't maximize and put it into full screen. I tried to verify my game content and it told me my game content was corrupted, so it repaired it for me. That was the first thing I tried when I tried to fix this issue. And that didn't work. I launched the game again and it just crashed and it gave me the minimized window again. I tried to verify my game content again. It said it was corrupted again and repaired it. And then I tried again and it didn't work. It still gave me this minimized window. So I went to Google because what the fuck else am I supposed to do? And then it told me to F11 to maximize the window and that worked. So hooray, first problem solved. Next problem. I got into the game and it gave me this login status exception exiting the game dialog, which it did exactly what it just said, which meant it exited the game for me. I went back into the game, gave me the same dialog again, exited the game. I went back into the game, same dialog again, exited the game. Fourth time it worked, and I got into the starting menu of the game. So as you can see at the bottom of the starting menu, it says tap anywhere to enter the game. It says tap because, again, this is a mobile port to PC. It's not a natively PC game. Genshin isn't either. But I would argue that Genshin does feel a bit more like they put some effort into the PC port than this game. This game is just a full-fledged controls scramble to death. It doesn't really make any sense. It's just very obviously a mobile port to PC. So what happened here? Well, it told me to tap anywhere on the game. I did that with my mouse, left click, and then it went into a loading animation for this server. I assumed that it was trying to connect to this Aiden server, which has a red icon, right? That was the default. I didn't realize this at the time, but it has a red icon, which I assume means that it was full. So it just tried to load into the server. It couldn't do that. I couldn't get out of the loading animation either, so I just waited for 2 minutes, after which, being the dumbass that I am, I clicked again, and it did the exact same thing for another 2 minutes. And then it disconnected from the server. So after that, I wised up. I went to my own region, which it turned out that Aiden wasn't in my region anyways. I think it was in the Pacific or Asia region, but I'm in North America, so that's what I picked. I went to Libera, and then it put me into an estimated queuing time of 14 minutes. Even though this is green, this is a green server, it's supposed to be the least populated server, or at least that's what my intuition tells me. Maybe it's the opposite, maybe green means it's full. 14 minutes. I just said fuck it at this point, I don't want to play this fucking game anymore. I quit playing, I went to do something else, and then I came back. And then finally, it worked. So that was 1 problem, 2 problem, 3 problem, and 4 problems. I had to like go through 4 problems just to get this game to fucking work. And it didn't even work in the end. I just waited for a couple of minutes. I don't know, it was not really a couple of minutes. It was more like a couple of hours before I could start playing the game. So that was my journey to actually starting Tower Fantasy. Pretty generic MMO problems for a first day launch, right? Not anything unanticipated. This has happened in the past before for many MMOs. It's just that at my age, at the age of 29, I'm a bit over servers. I'm a bit over all of these MMO shenanigans. Genshin Impact sometimes has the same problems as well. Most of the time you can log into the game, but there are times that even when you do log into the game, there is some lag between your actions and what actually goes on the screen. But for the most part, you can log into Genshin Impact and start playing the game, even though it might not be the most optimal experience. MMOs, on the other hand, holy fuck. You gotta figure out if you're on the same server as your friends. You've gotta figure out if those servers have like some kind of function that lets you play with each other between servers, and then you have to figure out which servers are dead or not, or after the initial launch, if those servers are going to die or which servers are going to live on. It's just too much problems, too many problems. I already talked about how the idea of combining a gacha game and a MMO game together seems like it wouldn't be terrible at first, I guess, for the casual player, but it does create new problems. Like, how are you going to handle the PvP aspects? How are you going to handle the PvE aspects of the game when pay to win is such an intrinsic part of the gacha system? And the answer to this is that they didn't really solve it. PvE and PvP in Tower Fantasy are both pay to win from what I read, because I didn't experience any of that from the 2 to 3 hours I played. This is moving on to like some of the stuff I read, right? But apparently in Tower Fantasy, in PvE, there is no scaling like in PvP. In PvP, they do scale your weapons and your abilities to the same level as everybody else in PvP. But even then, you can still play the gacha game to get more weapons, to get more weapon options. So in the end, it is still PvP, even though it is less pay to win. Even though it is less pay to win than some other PvP aspects of MMOs, it is still in the end pay to win. And that just destroyed any motivation for me to, deal with all of this login issues, all of these game issues that I will talk about in a moment. There's no motivation for me at all to keep playing this game. And PvE is even worse. It is literally just what it sounds like. If it's not skilled at all, so once you get the best weapons and the best gear by playing the gacha system, then there is no point to continue playing. If you're a free-to-play player, you're always going to get carried by like pay-to-win players. So what is even the point? I don't understand. Yes, the gacha system might be more generous than Genshin Impact or other gacha games, but you have to understand this isn't because the developers or the people making this game or the people handling the gacha system are more generous. It's because they expect this kind of gacha system to make the optimal amount of money for them. If they had a gacha system that was as, brutal as Genshin Impact or Fate Grand Orders, then they wouldn't make as much money. That's all that matters to them. It's not a matter of them being generous. It's a matter of them optimizing how much money they can make. So the fact that this game does have a more generous gacha system does imply that they don't expect this game to succeed if it had a worse gacha system. It's an implication of the quality of the game itself rather than how generous the developers are. So I don't accept the argument that just because this game has a more generous gacha system means it is a better game. That's not true. Okay, so moving on to some of my actual problems with playing the game itself. I'll go over this Reddit post, which I found really informative, by a doctor on Gacha Gaming Sub on Reddit. It doesn't cover all of my problems with the game, but I think it does cover at least 50% of the problems. So I'll just read off some of the pros and cons listed here and give you my opinion on them. And that'll probably get rid of at least 50% of what I want to say. So thought I would just toss out my initial thoughts on the game for anyone curious about it. This is about the feel of the game as a new player, rather than a real review. Cool cutscenes, action sequences. There is a section early where there's a lot of combat and bullets flying everywhere, and I appreciated the attention to detail and the quality of the animations. Yeah, I think the cutscenes aren't terrible, but there are points that are really, really weird. Like, right at the beginning of the game, right, there is a segment where you have to do like QuickTime events, but did you know that if you don't press the buttons for those QuickTime events, at the very beginning, when you're trying to escape from the three-headed Cerberus wolf, or whatever it's called, you don't actually have to press the buttons. There's actually no fail condition. If you don't press the buttons, the cinematic that plays for that just happens a bit slower. You can actually just not press the buttons at all, which is what I did. And it just happens. It's just like after the slow motion segment, it just continues with the cinematic. So these are just kind of like mechanics that exist for no reason, which made me feel like the action sequences tried to make this more of a game than it is. So that felt kind of cheap. But I do admit that the cool cutscenes, the action sequences are, I would say, almost on par with Genshin Impact. Okay, here comes the Genshin Impact comparisons, right? Yes, there are like good cutscenes in Tower Fantasy, but I don't think they are better than Genshin Impact. I do think they have their own like action style, but it's not comparably better than what you would find in other MMOs or other, gacha games such as Genshin. So moving on, combat itself is fun. It's pretty much what you would expect from game heavily boring from Genshin. Your weapons seem to pack more of a punch in this one. I actually found the combat to be a bit more similar to Honkai Impact than Genshin. I don't know why it is, but that's just my gut feeling. There's no elemental system in Tower Fantasy. It's more like you just pick whatever element does the appropriate damage to the other element that is needed for the enemy. So I don't actually think it borrows that much from Genshin Impact. In fact, the system for abilities is completely different because the gacha in this game is not pulling for characters. You do get character skins when you pull for the appropriate item, right? The items you get are actually weapons, and weapons come with character skins. This is something I'm also a bit skeptical about with Tower Fantasy, which is that Genshin does a lot to hype up the characters, to market the characters. Before a character comes out, you get the spoilers for them, you get the leaks for them, and then you get a character splash art, and then you get a character teaser, and then you get a character demo. And then when the character comes out, you also get like a character ability showcase. And that's not even counting the official trailers and all this bullshit that you would get otherwise. Whereas for Tower Fantasy, I don't see a lot of people making fan art for Tower Fantasy characters. And just the fact that you're pulling for weapons rather than characters is, I believe, is a detractor to its longevity and ongoing popularity, because people naturally they naturally like create connections with characters more easily than weapons. And just because the characters in Tower Fantasy are essentially just skins makes them less necessary and less intrinsic to the plot and as well as the experience of Tower Fantasy, which isn't like necessarily bad as like a gameplay choice, but I do think it misses out on some of the more traditional aspects that make gacha games so addictive, which is that you want to get all the characters. I just don't think pulling for weapons is going to be as addictive as pulling for characters. That's just my core opinion. It's obviously subjective. So moving on, character design, quite satisfied with the details, outfits, mannerisms, etc. The character designs are serviceable, but I don't think they really excel in any way. The splash arts are pretty good, but I don't think they're as good as Genshin Impact, and they're also not as good as Arknights. Arknights doesn't have 3D models, but the splash arts themselves are like A+++ SSSS tier. Whereas in Tower Fantasy, I almost feel like they don't have their own style. And not only that, they also have the same problem that Albedo has in Genshin Impact, where the splash art does not necessarily match the in-game model. You all know that Albedo's hair kind of gets scuffed when it gets translated into a 3D model in Genshin, but I feel like that's the case with all the characters in Tower Fantasy. They all feel like they're just all the 3D models for the characters feel as though they're cosplaying as their splash art. That's how I feel. So yeah, the character design is decent, but I don't think it's anything to write home about. Voiceovers, you'll probably recognize various VAs from other games. It's all top quality. That being said, I did run into some lines that were missing or mismatched. Yep. It's not just the voiceovers either. It's like the entire audio direction of this game feels cheap. In the first area that I went into when I first started the game, there is a place where you can get electrocuted, and there is no audio effects for that. It feels like a situation where I would potentially lose HP. I didn't lose HP either. So I just stayed in the area and kept on getting electrocuted, and there was no audio for that. At a later point, I was going through a drawer to search for items, and the audio for that got stuck. So for the rest of my playthrough, which I didn't even bother to like log out of the game. I just got stuck in that audio. That the audio cue for searching the drawer just kept playing and playing and playing and playing throughout in my entire time playing the game. So that's just another bug, another way in which this game is just so jank and so unpolished. There's not a lot of audio cues. The audio balance as well is not the greatest. Like I noticed that when I moved from away from certain spots, the audio for that spot would just disappear completely. And some characters felt like they weren't speaking loudly enough, like they weren't audio balanced in the same way as other characters. Like certain characters would speak on a higher volume, while other characters would speak on a lower volume, and it just felt so disjointed. So yeah, the voiceover is also nothing to write home about. I don't think it's any worse than Genshin Impact. In fact, I prefer the mascot's voice to Paimon's English voice in Genshin. But I don't think the mascot is as important in Tower Fantasy as it is in Genshin, so that's not really a fair comparison. Yeah, I think that does it for the audio of the game. What am I missing? I feel like I have something else to say about the audio, but okay, let's just move on. When you need an element to unlock a chest, there is often an interactable nearby that you can use to open it without needing to switch weapons. This is a really nice improvement over the party switching chore in Genshin Impact. Yeah, I always felt like it's not like a big deal, but I feel like this is a very small positive for Tower Fantasy. In Genshin Impact, I always felt like it was kind of annoying that I had to switch elements just to get mine certain rocks and some shit like that. Like you always needed Zhongli or another Claymore character to get certain like mining abilities. So you needed Claymore characters to get iron ore, not iron ore, but just ore in general, and you needed Zhongli to, smash those rocks so you can gather them. That made it so that in the overworld I had certain teams for exploration, while another team for actual combat, which was not like the biggest deal. So I guess this is a small positive in Tower Fantasy's direction. Moving on, vehicles are nice touch, as is infinite sprint, doesn't drain stamina. In general, exploration is easier than in Genshin Impact due to the verticality of the jetpack and fast stamina regeneration. I disagree with this. I think it's something for Tower Fantasy to have vehicles, but sometimes I wonder if like Tower Fantasy just has these things just because it's an MMO and it feels like it needs to have mounts and vehicles and all this shit, rather than because it actually needs it. Like if you were to tell me that Genshin Impact needed mounts, I would be asking you like why does it need them? Why does it need mounts? There's already teleport points all over the place. So it's just another form of transportation. There are some things, like individual things, I do like more about Tower Fantasy though. Like when you're swimming in Genshin Impact, we've all experienced just running out of stamina and instantly dying in the water. While that doesn't happen in Tower Fantasy. In Tower Fantasy, when you're swimming and you run out of stamina, you just lose health. And I think that should be the case in Genshin Impact as well. But again, this is one of those points where I feel really guilty about saying that Tower Fantasy as a whole is bad, but I really do feel like these individual good things about Tower Fantasy don't collectively come together into a cohesive package that makes me want to play Tower Fantasy over Genshin Impact. Like when I play to these good parts of Tower Fantasy, I just want to have them in Genshin rather than play more of Tower Fantasy. And I feel like this is going to be the case. Just my gut feeling is that this is going to be the case for a lot of Tower Fantasy players because they do come over from Genshin Impact. You can't tell me they don't, because as a pay-to-win gacha game, it's not going to be that attractive to hardcore MMO players, whereas, it obviously visually looks a lot more like Genshin Impact, although I would say it does actually look more like Honkai. But Honkai is less popular, so less people are going to be able to make that connection. So the controls, now for the cons, the controls are a complete mess. Attacking with a controller is the same button as talking to people or picking things up, so you need to be carefully avoid story characters during combat sections, or you will freeze in place and start a dialogue, and your character will get attacked while you are locked in place. Significant parts of the game don't have any controller bindings, so you can't play exclusively that way. The keyboard plus mouse controls don't feel great to me either for this kind of game, so I've been using the controller for combat exploration and keyboard and mouse for interface stuff and occasionally random things that don't work in one way or another. The controller bindings are also spitefully scrambled compared to Genshin Impact and an Arcware, despite being made up of the same features. Yeah, basically, a lot of things are similar to Genshin Impact, not just in terms of the controls, but in terms of what you're actually doing, right? In Tower Fantasy, when you're gliding, there are these hoops that you can go through, and they speed up your gliding speed. That's in Genshin Impact. In Tower Fantasy, there are these like dandelions things that you can attack, and then they give you rewards. That's in Genshin. Same enemy types. You've got a fat enemy type and like a small enemy type. So it's very similar to Genshin, but there are just slight differences all over the place so that it doesn't feel like it's 100% Genshin, probably so that they don't get sued. But they often scramble it, as it's called here, in ways that we all know, like when we're in high school, right? And we're trying to quote things in our homework. And we don't want to just quote things completely. We want to paraphrase things. So we just change around the wording a bit. And then it always reads like it's a lot more awkward than in the actual text that you took it from. That's what it feels like in Tower Fantasy. For example, in Tower Fantasy, X is to drop down when you're climbing, whereas it's control in in Genshin, it's X to drop down, whereas it's control in Tower Fantasy. That's just a small thing, but obviously this guy has fiddled around with things much more than I have. I only played 2 to 3 hours. I didn't even think about using the controller. I have Genshin installed on my PS5, and that's where I use my controller for that game. I just don't really find I really don't find the need or the desire to play a PC game using controller. I would just use my PS5 for that. So obviously, another sign that Tower Fantasy is just a bit less of a competent port to PC than Genshin Impact is. The controls are also just broken sometimes. As an example, there is a section where you need to jump on a turret and use it to shoot down a horde of enemies. Turning with the mouse was broken for me, so I had to turn with the controller. Shooting with the controller was broken for me, so I had to fire with the mouse. Yeah, so there's aerial combat in Tower Fantasy. To an extent, you can do some things. You can do attacks in the mid-air. You can dash in mid-air. You can do like abilities in the... Actually, can you? I'm not really sure, but you can definitely use attack. Yeah, you can use abilities in mid-air. You can do attacks in mid-air. You have like a cover glider thing that you can go all the way up with. And there you also have a double jump ability. So these are just some versatility things that Tower of Fantasy has over Genshin Impact. But the problem is that none of these things work all that well, all that smoothly. For example, in Genshin Impact, when I first started playing the game, after about an hour, I was pretty used to the parameters of what was possible with the character in Genshin. Whereas in Tower of Fantasy, I felt like I was still trying to get the hang of what my turn rate was, what I could climb on in Tower Fantasy, right? One of the first places I went to when I was playing the game was inside of a building in the overworld. So this was open world. This wasn't an instance place. And then I went inside the building, and I couldn't climb on a surface, but there was a window above that surface that I could double jump across into the outside world, into the outside. And on the outside wall, I could climb on it. So this is just a bit more inconsistency that you don't see in Genshin. In Genshin, there are some surfaces in the open world that you can't climb on. There are some interactable objects you can't climb. The Tower of 7, you can't climb that, except for the actual statue itself, which was really weird, but I don't know how that works. But in Tower Fantasy, this is all over the place. There are a bunch of things you can't climb on in Tower Fantasy. Not only that, the climbing itself seems just a bit more janky than in Genshin Impact. So moving on, there's a lot of random upgrades. It reminds me of the confusion of starting a game that has been around for years and has tons of systems in place. How you get materials introduces more confusion for me. There are chests that you can't open because they are on a timer. Why? What is the timer for? Holy shit, this is one of my major gripes with the game. It is completely unimmersive. It is completely like if Genshin is is a Breath of the Wild clone in terms of how it does its exploration and world building, then Tower of Fantasy is like, how do I call it? Tower Fantasy is just Tower Fantasy. It literally time gates your ability to open chests in the game. Not only that, there's like this MMO mechanic where there's a progress bar whenever you're searching something. Like, why is that there? I don't understand. Is that just there because it's supposed to be an MMO game? Does it serve any kind of purpose? Or is there just a progress bar because this is supposed to be an MMO game? See, this is another thing I don't like about Tower Fantasy, which is that it has all of these MMO mechanics, but I don't know if these MMO mechanics actually make the game better or if they're just there because it's supposed to be an MMO. For me, there's no purpose to having a progress bar. It's just there because this is an MMO and I should have it. Whereas in Genshin, when you open a chest or you search something, it just happens immediately. Another thing I don't like about Tower Fantasy. So yeah, the chests that you find in Tower Fantasy are time locked. There is literally a timer on those chests that tell you when you can collect those rewards. So that's what they're for. They're literally there to tell you when you can open those chests. And it's not like a resetting timer either. And it doesn't work in the way you would expect it, which is that when you enter the game, based on your playtime, those chests will open. That's what I thought at first, but from what I've read, that is not the case. If you started Tower Fantasy right now and then you just waited a month or two, then all of the chests will be unlocked for you. It actually counts the time of your playtime starting from when you first started the game. So if you just waited 30 days or 60 days, then all of those chests will be open for you. Which is just crazy. Like, what game does this? Some chests require an extra item to give you full rewards, but where does it come from? Should I ignore chests until I get the extra item? I don't know either. Note that, of course, these questions will all have answers, but the game itself ought to take care of that. Yeah, it's just... It feels like there's a lot of conditions to what you're doing in Tower Fantasy that doesn't exist. It might exist in Genshin Impact, but it's not as intrusive. Whereas in Tower Fantasy, I'm always wondering, like, when can I do this? What am I doing this for? And what is this item for? In Genshin Impact, when I started playing the game, I didn't know what the fuck I was doing. I just went around exploring the place and I had fun that way. But Tower Fantasy's world is a lot less interesting. I don't really care about the characters. I don't really care about the story. The geography of the game feels less detailed, less natural than Genshin Impact. In Genshin Impact, it almost feels like the geography was created by someone who actually has a degree in geology or geography, whatever it's called. Whereas in Tower Fantasy, it just feels like a generic MMO world. It feels like things exist for me to take advantage of. That is obviously still the case in Genshin Impact. There is like a place, a city for you to go to like do your crafting and all that bullshit. But it just feels a tad more artificial in Tower Fantasy. Since the game is in a shared world, there's no pausing, and that also means enemies can just wail on you while you are in a cutscene. It feels really sloppy. When you have the map up, your character will still respond to your action movements and inputs. I nearly fell off of a cliff because my character dodged when I was trying to exit the menu. Yeah, there's no actual pause button in the game because this is an MMO. And I feel like I'm a broken clock now, but this is another thing. What exactly improves the game by being an MMO? Does it actually improve the game, or is it just another is it just another facet of them copying Genshin or Honkai and then saying, okay, we gotta make it slightly different to set us apart from Genshin and Honkai and Hoyoverse games? Or did they actually want to make a good MMO game with some Genshin and Honkai elements? And for me, this is definitely one of those places where, by virtue of them being an MMO, this game was actually downgraded. The interface is messy, lots of submenus and things aren't always in places you would expect. Yeah, again, just a lot of jankiness in general. Again, Genshin Impact feels more intuitive. Tower Fantasy is just a bit less intuitive than it should have been. The login queues were around 5 to 15 minutes for me. At least the servers were up though, so maybe it's better than some games are. I believe there aren't really queues anymore, but for me, there definitely was a 14-minute queue when I first started the game. Again, MMO things, MMO problems. What can you do? Difficulty, too early to have any clue here. So far, I felt like nothing was either too hard or too easy. I feel like difficulty is going to depend on how much you will. I watched a lot of Asmongold's stream, and honestly, it felt like he was just like blasting through everything. And judging by what Mtash has said, it's not too difficult either. One of the things he wanted the game to be was to be more difficult than Genshin Impact, because that was one of the things missing in Genshin Impact's gameplay. But for judging from what he said, that doesn't seem to be the case. Character balance, importance of rarity, etc. same as above. Too early to know anything about it. My question is, are people going to keep playing this game after the next 2 weeks, after the initial launch, to get to the point where people actually do have a meta? Because I'm extremely skeptical about the future of this game, not only because it's an MMO and a gacha game, but also because like when you search Tower Fantasy on YouTube, like what do you actually see? What do you see on this page, right? You see Vulcan, Asmongold, Erotic Walrus, views 32k, 216, Hydro Sam 36, Lazy Peon 362. This is a month old. Asmongold again 208, 105. I Went to Lose Gaming, Sino, MMO Byte, Hero Hey, Mtash, Moga, Enviosity. Like 50% of these content creators are actually ex or currently Genshin Impact content creators. And the rest are just random content creators who are just doing variety streaming and variety content creation. None of them are dedicated Tower Fantasy content creators. So what is going to happen when Sumeru, the next region for Genshin Impact, releases in 10 days? Its official live stream is going to be on air in less than 12 hours. So what happens when everybody goes back to playing Genshin Impact? What is the environment going to be like for Tower Fantasy's community once the majority of its players, once the majority of its content creators go back to playing Genshin Impact? Is there going to be anybody there to like keep the community going, to have like a meta, or to have just a Discord community just going on, promoting the game? Because what do you notice about the front page of Tower Fantasy? There is no Tower Fantasy channel. Like, you literally scroll down, and what do you find? You find a people also search for section that literally promotes Genshin Impact, Honkai Star Rail, Zenless Zone Zero, Honkai Impact 3rd, Arc Knights. These are other gacha games, and the majority of them are literally Hoyoverse games. You are more likely to find Genshin Impact content by searching Tower Fantasy than actual Tower Fantasy channel itself. You have to search Tower Fantasy trailer to get Tower Fantasy, the channel itself, which only has 49.6 thousand subs, compared to Genshin. Genshin Impact has 5.62 million subs. And when you search Genshin, the first result is an actual Genshin Impact, official Genshin Impact video, Sumeru promotional video, 3.5 million views, nothing to scoff at. Teyvat chapter interlude teaser, 10 million views. So 4.3 million views, 2.5 million views. Genshin Impact does its own promotions. It does its own marketing. Whereas Tower Fantasy seems to mostly depend on content creators. And even more suspicious to me, where do you see the actual developer company's name here? You don't see it. There is no promotion of themselves as a brand. They're developed by Hota, which is owned by Perfect World. You don't see Perfect World anywhere here. The only place where you can see Hota Studio is in this corner over here, below the available now a shared open world section, with the same color as the background. It's like they don't want you to see that they're made by this studio. It's because they're not confident in the game's quality. They don't want you to tie this game and its potential failure to Hota, so that they can continue to use Hota as a studio brand in the future. That's what Perfect World wants to do. So that's just my interpretation of the potential, guards that Perfect World is now putting in place, so that if this game does fail in the West, they're not going to get bombarded. Their brand's not going to go to shit. This is what I would do as a marketing like executive or somebody in that position. Whereas Genshin Impact, you press Genshin Impact, right? You go to About. Genshin Impact is an open world action game proudly presented by MiHoYo. It's made by MiHoYo. It's really easy. It's really easy to see what company is making it. They're very proud of their brand. It's there. Tower Fantasy. Nowhere in this page can you find Hota or Perfect World. Nope. Twitter, not here. Facebook, nope. Discord, not there. Instagram, not there. It's nowhere to be found except for this one part over here. Yep. If you search this little blurb here, no Hota. They don't want to promote themselves. And even on the Tower Fantasy page, you'll notice that there is a Reddit thread just about how many comparisons there are about Genshin. If you search this thread, search Genshin, look at how many like yellow spots there are. It's literally just comparing to Genshin Impact. So don't give me this bullshit about how this game should be evaluated in like some kind of vacuum where Genshin Impact does not exist, because most of the players, I bet the majority of the players playing this game are going to be either ex-Genshin Impact players or ex-Genshin players, or just currently Genshin players, but they're taking a break. They're using this as a Sumeru waiting room so that when Sumeru does release, they can go back to playing that, and perhaps this game will just be forgotten. I don't know. It's not like a crime to play two games at the same time, but after people go back to Genshin, are they going to come back to this game, or are they just going to use their time to play something else? Because the gaming world moves so fast now, it's very rare for a game to last more than a year, or like a few weeks at most. So by the time that they're done with Sumeru, is there going to be another gacha game out? Maybe Wuthering Waves or Arknight's Endfield that is coming out, and then this game will just be dead. Okay, so going back to this Reddit post, I'm trying to think of stuff that they haven't mentioned that I also have a problem with. Did I mention that this game has no VSync option? It doesn't seem like this game has a VSync option, and I'm pretty sure it has one in Genshin. So, on the technical side of things, I also expected this game to be technically more optimized than Genshin Impact, because that's one of the problems with Genshin Impact, right? It's a very graphically demanding game for a mobile game, and even on PC, it doesn't run that well. On PS4, it's nearly unplayable. On PS5, it's good, but it's still not the best. It runs on Unity engine. I don't know if that's the problem, but whatever the case is, no matter how good my system is, I've played this game on laptop. I've played this game on my PC. It runs an i7 9000K, an i7 9700K. 2070 Super, 270 Super, 16GB RAM DDR4 SSD installed, all that bullshit. It's a pretty decent PC, but on max settings, I still can't get this game to run without stutters. And it's not a problem with the frame rate, it's a problem with the frame time. And sometimes it doesn't even show the frame time being any different. Sometimes it'll just stutter for no reason, and this is a consistent thing that keeps happening in Genshin Impact. Unfortunately, that's also the case with Tower Fantasy. Not only is there no VSync option, there's no option to turn off the blurring effect either. I don't know why that is. Maybe they just thought that mobile, like as a mobile game, mobile devices wouldn't be able to handle no blurring option, so they just kept that for PC. Also, another sign that PC is kind of like a second thought. It's a mainly mobile game, and they just didn't put as much effort as Genshin did into porting it from mobile to PC. And when you get into the game, it doesn't run any better than Genshin Impact. Technically speaking, it doesn't look any worse than Genshin Impact, but I would argue that subjectively, artistically speaking, both the characters, the character models, as well as the environment itself is artistically less detailed than Genshin. They obviously didn't put as much detail and effort into the overall world building and the environment, which makes it look, as I said before, like it's an artificial MMO game. Genshin, again, still has that, just to a lesser degree. All of the problems with Tower Fantasy just seems to be it's not as good as Genshin. It's not as polished, and I'm not sure like who is going to be playing this game in 2 weeks after Sumeru comes out. So those are my basic thoughts on why I quit Tower Fantasy after only 2 to 3 hours. I I don't expect everybody to have the same opinion as me. This is, after all, just my opinion. It is subjective, so don't hang me. I will be interested to see whether or not this game has legs, whether or not it'll still be ongoing in like 2 weeks or three weeks or after a month. But my perspective right now is that it will have to do something different than what it has done in China, because in China it has kind of stabilized around the same place as Arknights. Arknights is like a 2-year-old game now, so the fact that it's only doing Arknights level of, profit and popularity is not the greatest thing in the world. It's certainly not dead. It's just not something I would keep paying attention to. I already quit Arknights, which is also another gacha game, if you didn't know, that I played before Genshin, so there's no reason for me to keep playing this game either, since this game is closer to Genshin than Arknights. And Arknights is by no means a bad game, I just don't have the time or the effort or like the motivation to keep playing another gacha game. So tell me what you think in the comment section, like, subscribe, and all that other bullshit you do on YouTube. If you disagree with me, I also want to hear your opinions. See you guys later. This is Bench Gamer signing out.